Once upon a time, like many, I did not understand the intricacies of making alcohol and the differences between various drinks. I didn't understand the difference between cognac and brandy, scotch and bourbon, dry and semi-dry wine. I drank what was on the table and didn't think about tasting it. Over time, I decided to change my attitude towards alcohol, began to taste it, look for different shades and undertones, and learn new things. Recently, in a conversation with a friend, he insisted that Jack Daniel's is a classic American bourbon. I argued that this is not bourbon, but a Tennessee Sir Mesh. After discussing and checking information on the internet, he agreed with me. Many people don't know the real difference between whiskey and bourbon. In this material, I would like to explain this in simple language. Geographical origin. Let's start with the most important thing, geographical origin. Whiskey can be produced anywhere in the world, for example in Ireland, Japan, and even Russia. But bourbon is produced exclusively in the United States of America. Essentially, bourbon is just a type of whiskey, just like Scotch. Scotch can only be called a drink that was produced in Scotland. The recipe for making bourbon varies by manufacturer and state. About 90% of all bourbon is produced in Kentucky, with the remaining 10% in other states. Raw materials for whiskey and bourbon. What's the difference? Many people don't know what whiskey and bourbon are actually made from. In response, I often hear, from grain. This is true, but the processing of raw materials when making whiskey is more complex than when working with bourbon. Grain raw materials undergo a malting process, soaking, germination, and drying. Whiskey is made from barley, rye, wheat, and corn, although the percentage of corn distillate is small. Real bourbon is considered to be a drink that contains at least 51% alcohol derived from corn. Barley malt is used minimally in bourbon. Often the second component is wheat or rye. For example, the famous Maker's Mark contains about 20% wheat distillate, and Four Roses contains about the same percentage of rye distillate. The classic bourbon is Jim Beam. Aging time for whiskey and bourbon. With whiskey aging, everything is simpler than with bourbon. After 2 or 3 distillations, the whiskey must be placed in oak barrels for a minimum period of 3 years. The casks can come in a variety of forms, often using recycled bourbon or sherry casks. There are 2 types of bourbon, straight and bonded. The first must be aged for at least 2 years, and the second for at least 4 years. To age bourbon, exclusively new charred oak barrels made from American oak are used. However, there are no strict requirements for the type of oak barrels can be made from French or Caucasian oak. Strength requirements for whiskey and bourbon. Classic whiskey is produced by distillation in copper stills. Scotch and Irish whiskey are made this way, but bourbon is first distilled through a distillation column and then through a copper still. There are strict rules for distilling bourbon. The resulting distillate cannot be distilled at a strength above 80%. According to American distillers, at this temperature, bourbon loses its character. After distillation, bourbon is poured into oak barrels, and its strength should not exceed 60.5%. Differences in taste and aroma of whiskey and bourbon. Now let's look at the difference in taste and aroma between bourbon and whiskey. It's tangible. It doesn't take an expert to tell the difference between Irish Jameson or Scottish Laphroaig and Wild Turkey or Maker's Mark bourbon. American bourbon has a sweeter and rounder taste due to corn raw materials. It is darker in color because the barrels are pre-fired. Even 2-year-old bourbon is often darker than 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. Bourbon can have vanilla, oak, rye, caramel, and spice notes. However, when it comes to variety and interest, for me, whiskey, especially Scotch, is more attractive. Bourbon is more about classic, versatile flavor and aroma. Thus, the differences between whiskey and bourbon are clear, and understanding these nuances can greatly enrich your tasting experience.